Welcome back to part 3. Now we're going to start to thinking about how this works in networks, and we're going to start thinking about some more contemporary social theory. One of the first places to start when we think about the virtual in contemporary terms, in terms of the internet, is an author. I already talked about William Gibson as coining the word cyberspace. He was also a science fiction author. But now it's John Stevenson who we need to go to for the novel Snow Crash, for coining a vision of virtual reality that we have with us today. It was introduced in his 1992 novel, as it says here in this article, Lord of the Metaverse Brain Scan, that was featured in The Economist in 2020. And he stumbled upon this as a bit of a coder in the early days of Apple computers. He had an Apple II. It was before there were graphical interfaces, and he was trying to play with code to work out how to create an illustrated novel. And he mistakenly, or sort of serendipitously, stumbled upon being able to create a mirror image of two spheres. It was very, very primitive way of creating a graphic, but it excited him. It gave him this sense that, maybe one day we could have computers that weren't just, data-based code computers based on operating systems like DOS, but perhaps ones that were more like what we have today, Windows, which are graphical interfaces, but that eventually a graphical interface might not just be the way in which we access data, but actually a whole new world that would be a double of the world that we have now, an alternate universe that he called the metaverse. And he kind of junked his illustrated novel plan at that point and used that idea to write his novel Snow Crash, which was an early cyberpunk novel. Now, the idea in this novel is that the metaverse was a persistent virtual world, accessible to individuals via special goggles, in which people could meet, claim territory, build things, make money, and more. So this is very close to the idea of VR as we have it today. And the impact of Mr. Stevenson's idea on the real non-fictional world has also been profound. So anyone working to create interactive 3D virtual environments is working on the foundations that Snow Crash, the novel, has built. So much so that he has become an influential figure in Silicon Valley, a futurist who is a consultant to, firms as large as Jeff Bezos' space launch company. He's, a chief futurist for Magic Leap, a startup making augmented reality glasses. And he is also a consultant to Epic Games creator Tim Sweeney, and the game engine that powers Fortnite, among many other popular games. And what he says here in this article is one of the things he really puzzled over in stumbling upon the idea of virtual reality as a kind of computer-generated alternative world was he was really puzzled with how we would ever get the money and resources to make it. But what he realizes now is that gaming is what generates that. It's the consumer base that creates the market for the creation of virtual reality that we're getting out there. Now, it's not the only driver of that, as I'll talk about in a moment, but it's one of the main drivers of it. So quite often now, when we're skipping into contemporary times, we think of virtual reality as VR, as that which happens on the internet. But of course, philosophers still remind us that there are many other ways that reality continues to be virtual for us in our everyday. And money is one of the first things that they turn to. And we'll revisit this next week when we think about exchange. So just very quickly, we're not denying that money exists, as philosopher John Searle says, but it exists, he says, in our collective minds. Its value is defined from the fabric of social reality. And in this way, he says, it's profoundly different from barter, where you might trade a goat for a musket, for example, or a seed for a mule. But money holds symbolic value only, and society needs to socially agree upon what it is, or it's literally not worth the paper it is printed on. Danaher, drawing on the work of John Searle, calls it an intersubjectively agreed upon fact. You can read that long quote if you want to on your own. So this was in fact just what Karl Marx said about money, and he came upon this concept when he was writing Das Kapital and trying to understand capitalism. And he traced it back to what he called commodity fetishism to explain what Searles is talking about here, this intersubjectively agreed upon fact. He's thinking about the relationships between concepts, that social reality, that people think is real, and that they then impute that social reality to objects, infusing those objects with a kind of inner animism, which they think it kind of like it radiates out of the thing. but they, in fact, have imputed the thing with that value. It's really not that different from the magic that maps sort of hold over us as well, that we kind of like, we think that is a real thing, but in fact, we have endowed a map with value. And it's the way that socially we construct knowledge, impute it to semiotic systems, and then they repeat it back to us. So in 1867, remembering this is the advent of modern industrial capitalism. This is why Marx is thinking about this stuff. He starts thinking about what he calls commodity fetishism. He says the word fetish is a Portuguese word for a West African custom, dedicating a shrine to a spirit that is thought to inhabit a particular place. So if you need to swim across a dangerous river, a sacrifice to that spirit of the river will help, and then you will succeed. In Marx's view of what's happening here, the spirit is an invention of the human mind, projected onto the altar. He said, and this is like what we do with money itself. The value that we have about this $5 bill is something that summons it from our own mind and attributes it to an object. But he says the Africans he saw dedicating this shrine and praying to it so they could swim across the river, experienced their own creation, their own projection as a superior being with powers of its own external to them, even granting the powers of life and death. And he said this is just how we think of markets and money. Our common attitudes to markets and money is that we treat them as something endowed with life and agency of their own, not our own creations. But in fact, Marx said commodities are made by people, and we intersubjectively agree upon its ontological status, what it is worth in existence. But in fact, especially now, it's just paper, or it's even worse, it's just data points that are being exchanged between computer systems. Yet we often experience markets as animated objects exercising a power over us that is devoid of human contact and a force that is usually manifested in money form. So prices go up and down in a way that undermines our ability to manage our own lives. And then Marx also says commodity fetishism is related to alienation, because by dissociating the human act of making and trading from money and transferring it to a symbolic object, money partakes of alienation in society. And he hoped people might overcome this alienation by demystifying money. We know that money is really a symbol system we agree and consent to in order to facilitate trade, and that human labor is the source of commodities, not God's. Yet, like Plato's prisoners in the cave, he saw that people were imprisoned by it. They believed that this shadow was real, and he was having a hard time re-educating them from that idea. Now, this is something that's troubled people about money even all the way back in Jesus' time, when the Jews asked him when they were testing him in the temple, should we pay taxes? Who do we pay? Do we pay our tithe to the temple, or do we pay, Caesar's taxes? He's this oppressive governor who's kind of colonized our region, and we don't really like him very much. And Jesus says, well, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, which is a clever answer, given the fact that Caesar's face is actually stamped upon this coin. Money, as Jesus even recognized it himself, is an instrument of the state. It is a thing that we trade in the state. So we need to ask ourselves a question here, as we're beginning to see the way in which networks are de-linking us from the state and allowing us global reach or different kinds of affiliations and associations and relationships than we had before. What is happening? So what happens when exchange networks can subvert the state is a question I ask. And I want to say that there's two general directions that that's heading in. And one is a sort of utopian kind of organic community through crowdfunding. So here you've got the example of the Humans in New York crowdfunding that sometimes goes on, where, through an image and a story, people who follow this Instagram account, Humans in New York, kind of, oh, here's a boy, here's an orphanage, here's a cause, generally in the third world, you get a million people who are following this blog giving $5 each, and you've got a lot of money suddenly raised. So this ability to very quickly raise money for moving causes, often far beyond someone's physical community, is something that we're beginning to see happen now that money has shifted from being something that is just distributed within a state in a sort of welfare system or profit-based system or redistribution system that we'll talk about tax as being next week. That might be a positive outcome, but you could argue that there'd be negative outcomes as well. I mean, some people would say that cryptocurrency is undermining the ability of the state to collect taxes from its people, and therefore undermining its tax base and its ability to support a local welfare state to provide social services such as roads or hospitals, state housing, electricity grid systems, many of the other things that states need to provide with our tax money. Now, let's move very quickly into some social theory that you need to know if you're going to be thinking about virtuality, and this is the concept of the hyperreal. Now, Jean Baudrillard is a French philosopher who gives us this notion, and it comes from his book Simulacrum and Simulacra, which he published in the 1980s. He was very interested in semiotics. He was building on the work of Jean Barthes and Jean Baudrillard, and he was looking at the way in which today, in a late age of advanced capitalism, far beyond the Industrial Revolution that Marx was theorizing, we live in a culture that is what he says a form of accelerated capitalist reproduction, where we now have mass manufacturing, and it is operated through a technocracy and a marketplace based on images, bits, and codes, not the real. And he gives examples of extreme places where you're overlaid by signs and symbols, like the shopping mall, for example, where you'll see, signs and flashing screens and images everywhere you go. And even the things that you buy might be images of things and copies of things, like the Nike shoes. What it symbolizes, more than what it is what you're buying. You're buying copies of things inside, that are mass produced inside of these malls that are called Stocklands, that are also kind of like Nowheresville. And he said, Disneyland is another example of that. Signs overlaid by signs, worlds overlaid by worlds, deeply commodified with no clear link to the real. And so what he's saying is that this idea of virtuality is not confined to computer VR, simulated reality, but simply laid bare through it. What he's saying is we actually live a virtual reality every day. And virtual reality is just kind of a mirror of our everyday existence. Now, how did he get to this notion of the hyperreal in simulation and simulacra? He breaks down 3 different kinds of what he calls simulacra, where he says the first order is what he calls natural simulacra, an original that is a copy. Now, an original, Mona Lisa, is an original painting, but it's a copy of something in the real world. And if you were still alive in Michelangelo's time, you could perhaps locate that actual person out there. And it's pretty difficult to confuse the real woman with the copy here. But this is the first order of simulacra. The second order of simulacra is kind of production simulacra. It's mass marketing. It's mass production line simulacra, where it is not an original that is a copy, but rather copies that have no original. There's no like one original iPhone where you'd be like everything else is produced from that one original iPhone. Everything is mass produced in the tens and thousands. And there's maybe one design and one prototype, but there eventually emerge millions of identical copies, and you could never tell one apart from it. He says this is basically where we're at in modern capitalism, which is commodified and largely based on symbols and representations, and where value is only value if it's recognized by the commodity and measured by engagement through a material image, for example. Like, and you might think of, well, why does somebody want to be Insta famous or an influencer, for example? Well, that's the place now where value comes from, is this sort of like virtual world where, if lots of people know you, then you're valuable. So value comes from accumulating some kind of capital through this, highly mediated world. And the third order simulacra, he says, is a copy without an original. It's a product of a complete amalgam of symbols. So, for example, the Wild West. It's not an original. It's not based on anything. It's only constructed through narrative, which recombines many different symbols, whether it's from, Buffalo Bill's circus stage shows that he used to take touring through America, or early black and white spaghetti westerns or movies. These are all stereotypes. They're not really based on anything real. They are recombined images and myths and copies of copies. They may have some aspect of the real in it, but that's more only in the way that they actually, as third order, contain first order simulacra and second order simulacra within them. And he said this third order is hyperreality. It tends to almost have an effect that it's more real than the reality it purports to represent. It's bigger than life. Disneyland is like that, right? We love it. It's just full of stimulation. It's returning to that original sense of the virtual. It's better than the real. And arguably, that's the phase we're at right now, this highly mediated world that much of it is accessed through our mobile phones, but even if we go out into an actual mall or down the street, there's signs and symbols and ideas semiotics just flashing everywhere. We're immersed in it. Now, the hyperreal, it might be fun and seem like it's larger than life, but it does have real effects. And this is something that you're reading this week by Shaw points out, because hyperrealizations are abstractifications of the world, and they lead us to a way of kind of thinking that we're living in a world of illusion or fiction or fantasy, where the people who produce this fantasy for us are very far removed from our world, and that helps us relate these ideas to networks as well. I'm just going to read this to you here. So Rob Shields, again, is mentioned here for his work, The Virtual, and he's talking about the representations of the health of stock markets being just charts or econometrics of a computerized news service, which routinely stand in for the actuality of economic life of nations half a world away. These are hyper-realizations in which the only reality of the stock market is the movements generated by charts and graphs. And what we don't see in these graphs is the effective exploitation of workers in countries in Indonesia and Malaysia, and the way that the stock market itself is dependent on selling commodities that are themselves hyper-real. For instance, the shoes that I'm wearing today are actually copies of a shoe originally produced for athletes in the 1950s. I've paid for the image of the shoes. The play of images across the surface of reality that links my shoes to the electronic representations of the stock market, but does not touch the deprivations of sweated labor, the damage to ecologies, consumer debt, and unequal distribution of money and power on which consumer capitalism thrives and depends, is what constitutes and maintains the hyperreal. So he's talking about the state of modern capitalism being very, very divorced from the conditions of production. So consumerism being incredibly divorced from the conditions of production is just one way in which the hyperreal can create almost an illusory, larger than life effect for certain people, but an incredibly exploitative effect for other people who are kind of like outside the matrix, if you will, or very far removed from that node in the network. So the stock exchange's hyperreality is described as a kind of reality at remove. And this is just a reading, a clip from the reading that you have this week. You can look at it further yourself, but he's basically saying the same thing. What we don't see in these graphs is the effective exploitation of people. And we can see how this hyperreal can have actual effects on us in our real lives as well. When if we spend a lot of time on social media, it'll tell you, these are your regular friends and your close friends and your acquaintances. It's often interesting to compare that to the people that you actually see on a regular basis. Have your real friends become the people that you mostly spend time on social media with? Is perhaps a question worth asking now. Now let's actually spend a little bit of time thinking about the nature of VR, because we haven't talked about it much, but it does lay bare, as I said, the large degree to which much of our reality is already virtual and mediated by signs and symbols. But there are elements, of course, which cannot be translated into virtual reality, at least not yet. So that first order of reality that Cyril talked about is certainly unable to be translated yet. The physical apple. We can't literally touch an apple yet or bite into it and taste it. Not yet, anyway. But the second and the third order of simulacra do comprise a large element of our own reality, and in the digitized lives we live, even more so. So that social element and also that functional element are there. Now, through other ways that virtual reality is being produced, more and more it is being able to create for us at least a simulation of that first order of reality through immersive experiences. Now, I talked about how Neil Stephenson was a little bit puzzled about how we would ever get the money to produce virtual reality on the scale that he conceived of it in his fictional metaverse, until he realized that gaming as an industry would produce the consumer base to fund it. So that's largely a kind of, I guess, people-funded way, I guess you could say, of making the metaverse. But another way is state-funded, and we need to remember that. As well as breaking up states, virtual reality can also work to consolidate state power in sometimes ways that we're unaware of, and that there is a relationship between the state and the video game industry that you may be unaware of. And this is often referred to as MIME, which means the Military Industrial Media Entertainment Complex. And this is a turn of phrase that originates from the original coinage of the term military industrial complex that came about in 1961, when President Eisenhower said his farewell address as president, who had presided in the aftermath of John F. Kennedy over the first kind of space race, and out of that, the building of the first kind of arms race during the Cold War. And he saw the way in which power was being consolidated in the coffers of arms manufacturers, and in industry that was supporting the Cold War and the space race. And he was worried about the power of those industries and the amount of money that they were making and their power for lobbying governments. So what he is referring to in the term the military industrial complex is the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry. And he warned people in his 1961 farewell address, which you could Google and watch if you wish, to guard against its unprecedented power. One of the reasons, as I said before, he was worried about it was the unprecedented economic influence on the democratic state in terms of the lobby power that this alliance of military and industry had at that time begun to gather. And was worried that it was having an effect on policy that was increasingly being made by a group of elite professionals that included military officials, retired military officials, and arms manufacturers who had military officials lobbying on behalf of them, as well as academic think tanks funded by military and arms manufacturers. And this is all covered in Noam Chomsky's famous movie, Manufacturing Consent. Now, the thing to say here is that the cost of this military industrial complex is largely masked from the general public. And even today, the media is generally given to the portrayal of a virtuous war with an ethical imperative and minimal casualties, embedding journalists, for example, in the war zone so that we can see from their perspective to garner support for wars overseas, such as in Afghanistan. When, for instance, in 2009, when the movie Avatar was made, which is about an immersive 3D experience and actually involves military personnel in its plot, the American government spent $215 billion on military that year, when, global statistics in that same year were telling us that $9 billion would feed everybody in the world every day, for example, and so on, educate people, and so this military industrial media entertainment complex is kind of like the military industrial complex 2.0, where it's added the effects of media entertainment on top of that, and it's become a large industry used to be able to train soldiers and test scenarios for personnel overseas, for example, or in dangerous situations. It's based on experiences of immersion, and it's increasingly about building affect-laden virtual environments of war games and action films, so forms of affective immersion. And this military entertainment alliance actually has underpinned the rise of a number of video games. Some, like the game Doom, were actually used to train military, and others, like America's Army, were actually designed by the military for sale on the commercial market. So I just raised that to say that, these networks that we're seeing coming out of new forms of virtual reality or virtual communities aren't always breaking the state. They're sometimes actually coming from the state and being deployed to consolidate state power. And part of the way that these new forms of virtual reality are so powerful is through the return of the appeal to pathos and the suppression of logos, the appeal to affect. So most communications theory in academia until probably the last 10 years has been based on analyzing language and discourse, the relationship between language, place, and identity, for example. But this is talking about an emerging field of non-representational theory that thinks about the experience of people at physiological, emotional, and relational levels, how things feel. And it draws on the philosophical field of phenomenology. As Connolly says in 2002, affect turns our attention to the ways in which places and people trigger neurological or biological responses that have more to do with the biology of nervous systems and chemical producing glands than with our cognitive capacities. And it formulates the connection between the social cultural world and the biological realm of our bodies. And that's the place where virtuality and virtual VR is playing around now with trying to understand somatic markers or affective images and how they can trigger higher order deliberative thinking and judgments, for example. People who study design as well are learning from this field in terms of learning how to strategically deploy certain colors to transfer sensations. For instance, example, to make people feel hungry when they enter a restaurant, and then wish to buy things, for example. So generally, this is a field of emerging virtual reality where people are trying to at least capture that first order of reality, that physical level, if not at the actual level of touch, at least by a simulacra of it, by kind of hacking our neurology. And it's not always used for evil. It can also be used for good. And this is the kind of thing that some anthropologists are now being dedicating their lives to studying. So while typically anthropologists did ethnography in the field, which was real, some, such as Rhiannon Morgan, who is the coordinator for the Diploma of Higher Education, have done their field training in virtual worlds. And her PhD was called Virtuality, an ethnographic study of sociality, being, and money in a multiplayer online world. She looked at the science fiction themed universe Entropia. People who study these kinds of fields of existence are interested largely in two different questions: the interaction between virtual reality and other orders of everyday life, and also the self-contained world of virtual reality itself, where they conduct careful observations of identities and relationships and interactions and placemaking and space-making in that world. So some of the questions that they ask is, what does this virtual world offer people? People often describe their cyber worlds as somehow more real, enabling more connection or a more comprehensive map of the real world than they experience without it. They often can feel a sense of FOMO if they walk away from it for a while, and so people will binge weekends playing VR games. People also describe going to a virtual world as a place of escaping this reduced, ateliated world to a better world. Here we have the return of perhaps the virtual in that first Platonic sense, the more ideal, the better. Or it may be a place where they have enhanced physical capabilities, where their avatar may actually be able to restore to them a sense of what's been taken from them in the physical world. If they're not endowed with, their perception of beauty, for example, their avatar may be more beautiful. Or in the movie Avatar, for example, Sully the soldier is a paraplegic who was wounded in battle, but when he enters to this other space in the virtual world and experiences kind of life in the Matrix, he has all his senses restored to him. So it can be a place where people actually have things returned to them, not just a place of deprivation. The other question that cyber ethnographers ask is, what is imagined as alternative reality? And this is where we might revisit Jungian's psychology, or think about the collective unconscious, or the hero with 1,000 faces, and those, basic hero's journey kind of undergirding narratives. So in virtual sci-fi worlds or online, this question is worth exploring. For example, in Stranger Things, when they enter the Upside Down, we can see that there is an augmented version of the self ideal there, where 11 or the other kids have all of these powers in the Upside Down that they don't have in their boring suburban existences in the real world. But we can also see it's a place where they have to face their fears or their desires and the prospect of being out of control. Other questions about the virtual world is what kinds of communities form online. So Searle points out that many aspects of our everyday lives can be represented in VR, even though, as I said already, the apple cannot yet be duplicated there. Functional and social aspects of life definitely can be. And so what aspects are enhanced? These are the things that you might want to think about. Perhaps we might want to think about the way gender is being perceived or portrayed in these places. Sometimes it's more highly gendered, so there's perhaps more toxic masculinity in certain games than others. But in other ways, people are able to, perform genders that may be more in line with how they identify in the real world. As I mentioned, we might also think about disability on the internet, or what aspects we might think about are suppressed. So, for example, early theorists such as Burkhalter started to ask questions about race in virtual worlds and how race may be suppressed or less visible, thinking that perhaps in a virtual world it may be raceless and classless, but was surprised to find that this was not the case. In fact, it tends to be either enhanced or follow some of the stereotypes of the real world that enter in a hyper-realized way in virtual reality. So lots of questions to ask about virtual reality. And finally, you might just ask yourself, what are the implications of this hyperreal? Is it kind of like going back to Plato's allegory of the cave? Is it, we stuck in the Truman Show or the Matrix? If we live, as Baudrillard said, in a world governed entirely by signs, I guess maybe we're not far off from the shadows on the cave wall of Plato's allegory, seeing everything through image or symbol as representations rather than the real. What does that mean for our networks? Does it mean the end of democracy, or does it mean a reconstituted sense of community? But we also might think about the rise of fake in these worlds again, and how it threatens to enter our so-called real world or everyday world. Some recent work that's come out on deepfakes, for example, is something we might think about, how the world of the virtual and this computer manipulated reality is now penetrating things that we thought were once immune from that. So in the age of, the Enlightenment after Gutenberg's printing press and beyond, when we began to think about information as just the facts, ma'am, just positivist reality, and news is representing that. we are now seeing a place where this is highly manipulative, where we can get the rise of deepfake happening in our news as well, and beginning to manipulate the hive mind. So we might ask ourselves in conclusion, was Plato right to be worried for democracy and the level of the education of the masses if through virtual reality we can be so highly manipulated? Or you may ask yourself, is virtual reality a power for the good? Thank you for listening today.